Good afternoon. My name is Brinda Sarathi, and on behalf of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability, I am truly delighted to welcome you to Climate Change, Climate Justice, Organizing in the Face of a Changing Planet. This event is part of a series of gatherings generously supported by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And can we get the slide up, please? Our aim is to publicly engage around the fact of anthropogenic global warming and, more importantly, inspire action for social justice and ecological resilience. In addition to the panel today, we will be hosting a screening and conversation with director James Redford around his new film, Happening, A Clean Energy Revolution on March 2nd, to which you are all most welcome, as well as a training intensive for students titled Justice for Climate and Community on March 3rd. Please check out our Facebook page for more details. I would also like to thank and recognize the Redford Conservancy Board of Friends. If you could please just stand and have yourselves thanked publicly. Many of whom are Pitzer parents and in the audience today. I'm going to tell you how amazing they truly are because we have a board of friends, Kathy Wishenko, here with us today. I met Kathy this afternoon, and she is going to be pinch hitting and giving us a 5-minute presentation, given that one of our speakers literally just landed due to a flight delay and will be Skyping in for the first part of the presentation. So the Board of Friends, heart and soul, we are so lucky at Pitzer College to have you, and you have our backs. Thank you, Kathy. I'm just going to introduce the other speakers. I want to just give an overview of the panel today before Kathy takes the stage. The speakers today have been tasked with sharing a fresh and compelling perspective on climate science, research and communication, arts and activism, and community-based mobilizations for justice and sustainability. I know they will not disappoint, and I'm especially excited about the conversations with you all to follow. Dr. Getta Persad is a climate scientist at Stanford University. You'll initially hear her via Skype, and she will be joining us for a Q&A once she gets here from Ontario Airport. Dr. Persad uses global climate models to study the role of anthropogenic aerosols, the solid and liquid particles emitted into the atmosphere whenever humans burn stuff, in regional and global climate change. She combines the scientific understanding with economic and policy analysis to explore how the shifting global landscape of these short-lived but potent human emissions impact public health, infrastructure, and mitigation decisions. Second, we have Ryan Camero, who is a climate culture jammer, visual storyteller, and educator for social change. Camero's activism began in his hometown of Stockton, California, where he fought against apathy, illiteracy, systems perpetuating gang involvement and murder rates, and a general lack of opportunity. He was awarded the 2015 Brower Youth Award, the most prestigious award for young environmental leaders in the country, and he represented this state, California, at COP21, the international climate negotiations in Paris. We're also fortunate that Ryan will be joining us as one of 4 trainers at the March 3rd Climate Justice Workshop for students. Finally, Nwakama Agbo currently serves as the program manager for Restore Oakland, a joint initiative of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. She has been responsible for leading Target Cities, a pilot program designed to support 11 innovative neighborhoods in 9 cities across the country to achieve sustainability goals. While at the Ella Baker Center, Nwakama helped launch the Oakland Green Jobs Corps and later went on to develop the Oakland-based Soul and the City Civic Engagement Campaign. So now I want to welcome Kathy to buy us some time and also shed light on her own work. Thank you.
All right, I feel like I should talk very slowly as we wait for the other speaker to arrive. So my name is Kathy Washenko, and I'm the proud mother of a Pitzer freshman, Aaron Matthew. Yay. And a very brand new member of the Board of Conservancy, Board of Friends of the Conservancy. I am based in Seattle, and one of the pieces of work that I do is work with a small consulting firm based in DC called Breakthrough Strategies and Solutions that works to identify strategic opportunities for us to make progress on climate. And one of the opportunities that we identified several years ago and have continued to work on was the need for more effective ways for anyone really in a position of communicating to the public, but especially for candidates and elected officials, on how to communicate more effectively on climate. This was in the time frame around just following 2009, 2010, when there had been a failure to pass national climate legislation. There had been a real hope that we would be able to have gotten climate legislation through Congress, and that did not happen. And basically, after that, nobody talked climate for like a few years. It just like no one would even bring it up. And a lot of us said, we are not going to be able to tackle and actually address the greatest crisis facing humankind if we're not actually naming it and talking about it. So we set out to demonstrate how candidates and elected officials and others could talk more effectively by building a values-based narrative that would resonate with why people should care about climate. It was at the time, at the early stages of the Keystone Pipeline fight, which here we are, still the Keystone Pipeline fight lives on. But at the time, what was happening is we were seeing a lot of debates over like the number of jobs the pipeline would create and if those would be permanent or temporary jobs. And we were saying, we actually need to be having this debate on a whole nother level about what this means for the future of humanity if we continue to develop and use fossil resources when we're finding out that if we don't keep carbon in the ground, we are not going to be able to stabilize our climate. So we set out and did this national survey research and did a lot of gathering of communications experts and came up with what we call the climate narrative, a values-based way of talking about climate that walks through the threat, the villain, and the solution. And we've actually updated it once, and we'll probably update it again this year, heading into the 2018 elections, because as most of you may be aware, we don't necessarily have a federal government that is let's see, is working off the same science-based fact set that most people that have been engaged on climate for a long time believe we need to be. So there's a lot of hope that we could make progress and get other people into office that would help turn the tides. At the same time, part of the strategy is really shifting to what can happen in states and cities and businesses at the same time. So there's other strategies. But so what I'm going to show you now is a 3-minute video that sort of walks through our 3 climate messages that win. It explains how the climate narrative works and how it can be used. So, and then we'll see if our 3 minutes was enough.
We are seeing what the costs and heartbreak of climate damage look like. To protect our kids, to protect what's precious to us, it's time to speed up our transition from the dirty fuels of the past to clean energy that can fuel us today and on into the future. So how can we inspire action? Despite being sidetracked by politics and profits, there's good news. Strong majorities of Americans want solutions. Our research identified 3 top-performing climate and clean energy messages that tap into our shared values and resonate with Americans of all political stripes. Together, they form a persuasive narrative triangle. It goes like this. We can no longer ignore our strange and increasingly severe weather. We have a moral obligation to protect our children, and that means preparing for and tackling climate change now. But oil companies are spending billions of dollars to rig the system against clean energy solutions. We need to break their stranglehold on our democracy and put people not oil companies, back in charge. And investing in clean energy means investing in our own communities and taking charge of our own energy. Instead of subsidizing big oil, we invest in local energy, like wind turbines on farms, solar on our roofs, and schools that use less energy, creating local jobs, stronger communities, and a more stable climate. This simple, memorable triangle is a powerful tool for keeping our climate messages on winning turf, balancing the urgency of the climate threat and our responsibility to our kids with solutions that are ready to go now and that benefit our communities. Plus, straight talk about accountability for fossil fuel companies as the roadblocks to progress helps us see and then tear down those roadblocks and move forward. The message is strongest when all three parts are used together and supported with facts and concrete local examples. You can find the complete messaging guide with talking points and tips, research, and facts and examples at climatenarrative.org. Thanks, and please share this video with climate communicators in your networks.
Wonderful. Great. Well, I'm really sorry, everyone, that I am not there in person to give this presentation, but I think addressing climate change is going to require a lot of flexibility and innovation, so maybe it's appropriate that we're having to be a little bit creative to get me there giving this talk. But I do hope to be there for the Q&A and for the reception for any of you that can stay around for that. But I do want to take the opportunity to thank Brenda for bringing all of us together here and for inviting us all here to speak. I think this is a really amazing opportunity, and I'm really glad that we're getting the chance to do this. And I want to start off by just taking a moment to bring us all together, even if virtually, in space and time, which is why I've asked us all to consider time as the first thing. Because I think climate change can feel like a very sort of vague, abstract future thing that happens sort of in some distant place that none of us live in, and some distant future that somehow doesn't apply to any one of us here in this room or here on Skype. And I've been studying climate change for the last decade or so, and it's really only recently that I've come to recognize it for what it really is and for what I hope to be able to express it as today through the science that I'm going to be showing you. And as you may be able to hear, I'm in an airport right now, so you are likely going to get hints of that throughout the talk as well. So maybe that'll be food for thought as well. But I think, climate change can seem like a very vague, abstract thing, but, I've really come to appreciate through my work and through what I'll show you now that it's very much something that is here happening now, that is affecting us in our lives in ways that we care about now and that impact us now, and that it's affecting decisions that we make today. And that's really what I'm hoping to express over the course of the talk. And so if you'll bear with me, Warren, if you'll go to the next slide, I'd love for us to just do a quick little mental exercise. So I'd love for everyone to think about where we are right now in time. We're here in 2018. Brenda told me that there are students in the audience, there's some parents in the audience, there's people from the broader community there. So maybe the students are, and they're starting off the semester, the quarter. Parents are there seeing how their students are getting settled in. We're all sitting here in 2018. And now, if Warren, you'll go to the next slide, I want you to think back, say, 12 years to 2006. Think about where you were in 2006, 12 years ago. So for the students, maybe some of you were still in elementary school, still enjoying recess and learning ABCs and so on. And for some of the parents, maybe you were in that stage of life where you had really young kids and were trying to make that all work. For me, in 2006, I was starting my undergraduate career and taking my first course on climate change. So let's think for a moment about what our lives looked like 12 years ago and what 12 years of time has meant in our lives. And now, if we can go to the next slide, I want to take that idea of 12 years ago and think about it into the future. So 12 years from now is 2030. So for some of the students, maybe 12 years from now, you're where I am in my life right now. Some of the parents in the audience, maybe you're at the stage that my mom is at now, where you're wondering when your grandkids are going to come along. But I bring up 2030 because it's a date, this abstract date that I see all the time in my work. I see talked about both in the context of when we want to meet certain targets for reducing our climate change inducing emissions, or as this vague date when some of the really serious impacts might manifest from climate change. And I think it's very hard to wrap our heads around what something like 2030 means. But I think putting it in the context of our lives and thinking about what 12 years from now means by thinking about what has happened in our lives over the last 12 years and where we're going to be another 12 years from now is a really important way to think about the impacts of climate change. And then if we can go to the next slide, I just want to take that thinking of what 12 years in our lives looks like and extend that just another 20 years to 2050, because that's another date that comes up a lot when we talk about climate change and how quickly we want to start addressing climate change and when impacts are going to come up. And 2050 can seem very abstract, but for example, 2050 is when I might hope to see my first grandkids. So I think it's useful for us to think about these things not just as these abstract dates in the future, but as places and times that we and the people that we love might be living in. And just for context with climate change, many of you may have heard of something like a 2-degree warming target or a 1.5 degree warming target. I hope there are some looks of familiarity in the audience when I say those two phrases, because those are the targets for how much the Earth's temperature can rise that have been set by through the United Nations by essentially all of the world's governments as being the threshold where we would try to prevent dangerous impacts from climate change from occurring, that would happen at about 2 degrees of planetary warming. And that 2030 date that's on that timeline, on our current rate of emissions, we would pass the budget of carbon emissions to achieve that threshold by right around 2030. And we would be in that 2-degree warmer world by 2050. So we have until when many of the students in the audience are in my place to reduce our emissions. And we have until when my grandchildren might be coming into the world to try to avoid a world with really dangerous impacts from climate change. So this perspective also gives you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about from here on. I'm going to start with the now of where we are right now with climate change. And then I'm going to tell you a story of a particular climate impact, which is sea level rise, and how that's going to evolve through 2030 and 2050. And I'm going to talk about sea level rise because it's something that is very easy to think about in these abstract, vague terms, but I'll be showing you some of the science that shows that those things that we think are very far off in the distant future are actually much more immediate and may potentially be even more immediate than we thought they were. So that's where we're headed. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to start with where we are now and how we got to where we are. So here we're going to be looking at an animation of how global temperatures have changed since the mid-1800s, when humans first started putting carbon dioxide in the air in a really serious way. And what you'll see is that 2-degree threshold that I mentioned before, that's the outer red ring there. And the 1.5-degree ring that you see there, the inner red ring, is an even more ambitious target that a lot of countries in the world have been pushing for as what they see as the real limit to when we can prevent really dangerous climate change from happening. So if we can hit the forward button, hopefully this animation will start to go. And what you should see is you'll see a spiraling out of these temperatures from December to January through February, through March, through April, through May in each year. And very slowly you'll see that circle expanding outwards. And as we get towards the present day, what you'll see is that we're just kissing the edge of that 1.5 degree mark now in 2017. And what that is to show is that we're very much right now in that changed climate that you maybe hear talked about in the news as a hypothetical future, or that, you know, during the United Nations discussions that have been happening over the last many decades has felt like something that we were planning for in the future. But we are very much now in the changed climate. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just highlight that quickly. So here we're looking at some of the same information that you saw in the previous animation. And this is the change in the Earth's surface temperature from around 1900. The line in black is showing that number up until now. And those different colored lines are showing projections of how temperature might evolve into the future. So the red line there is the average temperature change that we might expect if we emit at a really high rate. And the dark blue line is what we could get if we were able to reduce our emissions really, really strongly. And if we'll move forward, you'll see that we are very much in that projection. We're here in the year 2020. We're where those lines are starting to diverge. And just for reference, if you look at that red line, I mentioned that 2 degree target. That intersects the red line at about the year 2050, so around where my grandchildren would be hopefully arriving on this planet. And where we are right now as a planet with our emissions is actually tracking above that red line. So we are headed for something that's not even on this graph. But this is still a very sort of abstract thing. It's a bunch of lines on a graph. What does average temperature even mean? What does global temperature even mean? And so if we can go to the next slide, now we're zooming in to the US. And this shows the temperature now across the US versus the start of the 1900s. And you can see that for most of the US, many of those places have already seen about a degree and a half Fahrenheit of temperature change. And forgive the units shift as we move here to the US from the international sphere. 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit is just a little bit less than 1 degree Celsius, which is what that 2 degree target I was talking about before is in the units of. But you can see that most places in the US are already past 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're very close to halfway to that threshold that I talked about already. But still, this is sort of abstract. None of us live on a map of the United States. We live in a place. We live in a community, we have a home, and we have friends and family, and none of that is really captured in a map like this. So if we'll go to the next slide, I really want to highlight that climate change is impacting now more than just these sort of abstract maps. It's impacting factors that really affect our society, that affect people that we love, places that we love, and decisions that we make today. So climate change manifests in much more than just temperature. It also manifests in increased rainfall, in changes in weather patterns, in a number of different factors. And the science has advanced now to the stage where we can look at events that are happening now and we can pinpoint the aspects of those events that are driven by human-caused climate change. So I'm sure many of you saw the coverage of Hurricane Harvey and the impacts that had on Houston. I'm originally from Texas. I have a lot of family in the Houston area and watched all of this unfolding. And scientific analysis can now show that human-caused climate change made the types of rainfall that we saw during Hurricane Harvey 3 times more likely than it would have been in a world without human-caused climate change, and 15% more intense. And loading the dice in that way is the difference between a person's house being washed away versus not. It's the difference between people's lives being damaged versus not. So this is already happening in a very immediate and quantifiable way. And if we go to the next slide, we know that these effects are also coming even closer to home here in California. So the mudslides that happened across Southern California in January are a key example of what climate scientists talk about as compound climate risk. And this compound risk, which I'll explain in a moment, is one of the reasons why we've reached a point now where climate change is starting to have impacts that are really beyond what we've seen before. So let me explain what I mean by compound risk. The mudslides, as I'm guessing many of you are aware, came as a result of a combination of a really intense wildfire in the form of the Thomas Fire that affected Southern California, followed by really extreme rainfall that generated this massive mudslide on soil that was already degraded by the wildfire. And we know that climate change increases the intensity of wildfire and the frequency of wildfires, and it also increases the amount of water that the air can hold and the risk of these extreme precipitation events. And either of those effects, either wildfires or extreme rainfall, can be really damaging individually, but when you combine them together, you can get impacts that are even more extreme than any one of them individually. And so that's the sort of thing that we've started to see with things like the mudslides in Southern California. So if we can go to the next slide. Another place where we're already seeing impacts is in the area of sea level rise. And this is where I want to transition to talking about some of these projections for the future and the way that the latest science is giving us a sense that this is actually, the things that we think about as being so far in the future are actually things that we are dealing with now and need to be dealing with now. And I choose to talk about sea level rise because I think the ocean can feel like the most vague and the most powerful thing compared to human beings. How could we as humans be changing something that is as massive of a force on the planet as the oceans? And I show sea level rise here just to demonstrate that even in this system that can seem like it would be so resilient to human impacts, we're already seeing the effects of human activity of the last several centuries. So what this graphic is indicating is that over the last decade or so, up in San Francisco where I live, we've had about 99 coastal floods over that 10-year period from 2005 to 2014, so about 10 a year, and 82% of those floods are human-caused because of the effect that humans have had on sea level rise, which is to say that around 80 of those 99 floods would not have happened without human-caused climate change. And if we can go to the next slide, we can see that these impacts are projected to increase into the future. So right now, California has about 170,000 people at risk of coastal flooding. And that number is projected to more than double by 2050. And you'll see here on that graph, 2030 and 2050, those two numbers that I talked about before. These are impacts that are going to be manifesting not in some abstract place to some abstract people who are not us. These are things happening in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime, and in our communities. And I think even more than that idea that the impacts that we currently see, that we're currently projecting are going to be happening in the very immediate future, it's also important to realize that the projections that I'm showing you on this graph were created with the best available science in, say, 2015. And since then, there's actually been a huge acceleration in our understanding of sea level rise and the different factors that contribute to sea level rise. So if we go to the next slide, as I was putting together this talk, I started looking through, what the latest findings were on sea level rise. And as I did that, I found this amazing combination of articles that have come out over the last year or so that really demonstrate how much our understanding of this is accelerating and how much it highlights the ways that these impacts may be even more severe than we initially thought. So Warren, if you'll just step forward through maybe 3 or 4, you'll see that there have been these articles coming up over the last year or so that have demonstrated that the rate of sea level rise is actually much faster than we initially thought that it was, that we can't just expect that it's going to continue on the same course, that it is getting faster and will continue to get faster, and that climate change is accelerating it. So those numbers that I showed on the previous slide are in fact an underestimate of how these impacts are going to manifest. And if we go to the next slide altogether, there is an article from Nature recently that highlights that there are mechanisms in the Earth system that we are only now starting to understand that may increase that number even more. So there was a study done looking at the dynamics of Antarctica, which is as ice melts from the Antarctic ice sheet, that's one of the big contributors that humans have to sea level rise. And there was a new study done that looked at how stable Antarctica was and found that it could actually potentially be a lot less stable than we initially thought, which would lead to much more rapid sea level rise than we had previously predicted or been planning for. And with the recognition of this new finding, people in the scientific community started to predict that potentially we could reach 6 feet of sea level rise this century, or 20 feet potentially in the century after that. And this is all still very abstract and very vague. What does 20 feet in the next century even mean? And if we go to the next slide, I think that this visualization is really important for all of us to sit with. So this is a project that's been done by Climate Central, which is a journalistic and scientific institution based out of Princeton University that's taken the latest sea level rise data and superimposed it onto different places in the world. And this is their depiction of what San Diego would look like with 25 feet of sea level rise. So this is a completely different world than the one in which we live. It's a very different paradigm. And I think being able to visually think about what this means is really important for grasping the magnitude of the things that we are potentially going to have to make very hard decisions about. So if we go to the next slide, I deliberately want to just take a breath and take a moment to think about what I've just talked about. I think it's clear that climate change is having very substantial impacts right now. It has the potential, it's already transforming the way that we live in certain places. It's already transforming the types of impacts that our communities are trying to handle. And as we saw with the sea level rise story, it has the potential to completely transform cities. It has the potential to completely transform how we do things. And this is not something that we can think about anymore as something vague and in the future and happening to other people. It's very much here and now. But at the same time, the same people, the same here and now that is being affected has also had the potential, I think, to create huge energy and huge change around a lot of these things, which is why I think what the two speakers that are going to come after me, why what they're doing is so incredibly important. And I had the pleasure to attend the conference, the 23rd United Nations Conference of the Parties in Bonn, Germany last year, which is the venue in which things like the Paris Agreement have been negotiated and have been settled, that have really given the global community a chance to start addressing climate change in a really meaningful way. And if we can go to the next slide, this is from one of the plenary conversations at that 23rd Conference of the Parties, COP23 meeting in Bonn, Germany. And up there on the screen, you can see two of the representatives from the Maldives, which is one area that is going to be really substantially, and is already being really substantially impacted by sea level rise. And you have communities like this at venues like the United Nations meetings, really pushing for strong decision making that takes advantage of all of the available science. And they've managed to get something like the Paris Agreement through that charts a course for addressing these issues in a really meaningful way. And if we can go to the next slide, another person that I had the pleasure of meeting in Bonn was a woman who you see there talking in the blue blazer, Mumina Bonaya, who's from Kenya. And she's part of an organization that is developing resources in Kenya for those communities to use the latest available climate science data and climate prediction data to start planning in their communities things like what sorts of crops they're going to plant that year, or how they're going to try to store water in a previous year in order to buffer themselves against a drought that's being predicted for the next year. And these things sound very minor and very limited in the scope of everything that all of the impacts that could potentially manifest from climate change. But I think it's real demonstration of the fact that people all over the world for the first time are really trying to move forward and make decisions around this in really meaningful ways. And if we can go to the next slide, the very last thing that I want to show that I think is a great entree to our next speaker. This is from the outside of the only official US event at the latest UN climate meeting. This is a community of students from the US that went to that meeting. They heard about the official US government event, which was focused on developing coal in the developing countries, which is in many ways directly opposite to the goal of reducing emissions globally in order to prevent some of those most dangerous effects from climate change. And these students came out, they made their voices heard, they sat in the meeting, and they sat here where this picture is taken outside the meeting, all through the halls of the UN gathering area, and they really made their voices heard. And I think that this is a real indication of the fact that people are starting to appreciate this and to really take this on strongly. So if we can just go to the final slide, I just want to end us back where we started, thinking deeply about the ways that climate change is affecting us already now. It's affecting the people that we love. It's affecting the places that we love. But because of that immediacy and because of that urgency, there's no better time to be here and now and making a difference. So I can't wait to see what else we talk about today. And I really look forward to getting your questions and chatting more about this. Thank you.
Let me just clear out for you here.
Yeah, before we put the slides up, I kind of want to start with a song thing.
Okay. Oh,
Hey.
you don't want the slides just yet?
Not just yet.
Oh, she'll keep them. Okay.
Yeah, and then can I just indicate once the song's done?
Yep.
Cool. Hey everyone, I thought that was super fun. Like, I know Getta's off the, well, it's not fun, but that last slide, I was actually in that slide. I don't know if anyone recognized me. It was this singing walkout that we did together. But yeah, before I get into the presentation and kind of talk about my story and my process as an activist of many efforts to try and stop the climate crisis, I wanted to start first with like an embodied practice, and I think that the last slide is a perfect opportunity to think about, we should consider time, we should consider the moments that we're in and the issues that we're dealing with for the future, but I also want to take a step alongside that and think about space, and think about how do we hold space for grief about climate change, for action, for compassion about the world and all the things that make up this world that we hold dear, and how do we use that space to like move things forward and create the movements we need. So I wanted to do an embodied participatory song because I'm a big fan of metaphors, and I think that if we can fill this room up with a collective song, then that metaphor in turn can really move us to seeing the world we want to see. So are people down for that? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna laser shoot. Pew! So you two, like that row, there's gonna be two flows that are happening here. So you folks will sing one part of this song, you folks will sing another part, and then we're just gonna do that for maybe a couple minutes. So I want everyone here on this side of the room to follow my lead and just like get into the flow of this song, okay? So I'm just gonna lead it for us to begin. And this is kind of like an opening to just get us into a positive and like positive mind space, because that was really depressing. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Can we try that? Surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds. Pretty easy? Cool. Cool. So just hold on to that for a second, and I'm gonna kind of do some volume stuff so I can really test like what people power can look like, you know? And then here, you folks, if we're thinking about climate change, we need to think about how we're like unveiling solutions and really trying to make space for the future we want to see, right? So you folks will sing this part of it. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. Come on, guys, we need people power. To light. We bring the truth, that's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. Let's go louder. Truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. Keep going. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Louder. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my... Keep going. No, keep going. Yeah. Truth to light. We bring the truth. That's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth. That's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth. That's right. We bring the truth to light. And on this planet, on this journey, we are learning, we are growing. On this planet, on this journey, we are learning, we are growing. Surrounds my energy. Positivity surrounds my... We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. We bring the truth to light. We bring the truth, that's right. All right. So if we hold on to those like mindsets, then maybe we could solve this crisis. Okay, so I'm ready for slides now. Do I just... Okay, cool. Oh, there you go. Okay. I'm going to bring my book over here, too. So, hey, everybody. My name is Ryan Camero. I am an arts activist and visual storytelling educator that works at the intersection of many different nonprofit organizations and movement efforts to try and come up with the conditions to create transcendent justice, which to me is defined as a justice that really taps into all the different systems of oppression that are happening and cuts them off at their source, which is a big endeavor to take on, and it's definitely something that is a collective effort, and I'm just trying my best to play a part by making art and doing weird stuff. So, this is a picture that I think ironically is like from like 2012 or something like that, and this is me at the Stockton Earth Day Festival, which is a festival I was volunteering at a long time to try and create interactive art projects for youth to learn about the local ecology of my hometown. And like my intro was saying, I started off my organizing really focused on nothing really related to climate, but in some ways I feel like it is connected to climate in the sense of the social and climate of my hometown, which was dealing with a lot of gang violence and drug abuse and like illiteracy and all sorts of issues that I really wanted to do something about. So there was a project that was based off the Dear World project called Dear Stockton, and I wrote, Dear Stockton, support innovation, not devastation, so we could figure out how to solve these issues and be able to like nurture the idea of how do we bring new solutions into the fold, how do we really solve those things. And through that work, I kind of got involved with a local group called Restore the Delta that was talking about water privatization. And I was like, what is that? What does that even mean? And I started learning about issues that were going on around corporations that were basically trying to build these twin tunnel projects alongside the San Joaquin River, which is a river I grew up on, as well as the Sacramento River, and suck those rivers dry to send to globally profiteering agribusiness and fossil fuel companies. And it was intense, and I was like, whoa, okay, like this is wild, and I kind of transitioned from like all these issues about gang violence and like the economy and started thinking about how do we fight like these massive unjust forces in the world. So I started getting into making protest art and volunteering with that group, and then I eventually became an organizer working on these issues. And a lot of what I wanted to do was try to create visual storytelling imagery that could really tap into tangibly how to create or embed dynamics of campaigns for people to pick up on and really understand what's happening. So here to the left is a slide about my work at the People's Climate March. I made this massive banner. A fun fact, that is the font of California license plate. And it has this tunnel vacuum that's sucking up water. In California's climate crisis, I think everyone knows that one of the most potent things that we're dealing with is water, and like how water is being inequitably distributed. Basically, the reins of our water systems are really held by big corporations that are trying to make global profits off of local resources. And with scarcity of these resources, it's important to think about how we take care of that resource. And then to the right was, I showed up with a bunch of folks to some State Water Resources Control Board hearings, which is like not something people would spend their Saturdays going to, but like how do we like start getting youth engaged in these like public processes that will affect us. So a lot of my work was really stemming from trying to make climate intervention something that we all were excited about doing. And if anyone knows about the water politics system, it's very nebulous and really challenging. So being able to visually translate or be able to create compelling ways for people to get engaged, I think is really important if we're thinking about the future of our resources. My work has really evolved into doing a number of different projects. Here I'm working on a protest banner at COP23 actually as well, because I was at the negotiations in Germany last year as well, alongside Getta. And we did an action calling out and really holding different communities in our hearts and our heads about how at the climate negotiations there was also an unveiling of this thing called America's Pledge. Has anyone heard of it before? America's Pledge? It's a coalition spearheaded by Governor Jerry Brown and the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, and they're trying to get a coalition of like cities and corporations and different forces to say we're still in the Paris Agreement. We still in the Paris Agreement. We still want to commit to climate justice, like in the country, which I think is a very, very. It was awesome that they did that, and it's also the communities that have felt the impacts of neglect from Jerry Brown in terms of not banning fracking or continuing to do offshore drilling. All these practices are things we need to keep any politician accountable to if we're really trying to create genuine change. So this was part of that process. But another group that I work with as well is this group called the Beehive Design Collective, which is a collective that uses metaphors of plants and animals to tell stories of environmental and social justice issues. So here, I created a draft of this graphic talking about the Twin Tunnels project, which years ago in 2014, it was called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And this graphic is specifically talking about how these tunnels were being put forward in this, like if you see in the center, there's this mansion that is the mansion of one of the most, the richest agribusiness billionaire named Stuart Resnick. Are people aware of him? And just kind of like his mansion's chilling there, and then on top of, below the mansion is this paper cloud of bureaucracy to represent this 40,000-page report that was released about this tunnels project that was only in English and in legal language that nobody could understand. And in releasing that to the public, really left out a lot of the diversity of California in terms of different communities that live off of that land, that fish along those waterways, that speak different languages. So this graphic was used as a way to talk about the lack of access of a project that would directly impact different communities. But then my work is really varied in trying to tell stories of these different issues. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of these images to give a sense of kind of some of the work that I've been up to. This is a graphic called West Coast Water Crisis. It's a series of different images that talk about different impacts of communities that have been impacted specifically because of the drought, which is a huge issue in California. One of the images isn't showing, but I'll show you a couple of the chapters. This is one of the chapters talking about migrant farm workers and how fracking wastewater is used for crops, which is a very controversial practice, as well as different human rights abuses that are happening with those communities. This third chapter here, Wading in the River, is talking about the Twin Tunnels projects and how it's impacting a lot of the ecology of the San Francisco Bay Delta, specifically the Delta smelt, which is this indicator species that the health of the waterways can be gauged by the populations in the waterways. So that is that graphic. And then the first chapter didn't show, but there's a chapter called Toxic Town that is talking about the impacts of fracking in communities and how children are particularly impacted in terms of the health impacts. So this last chapter is actually the Choose Your Own Adventure chapter of this comic project, which is saying climate justice now, and all three elements of the last few chapters are shown here. So in that first chapter that didn't load, there's this fracking dragon that's continuing extraction projects. There's the tunnels that are sucking up water. There's the hose that's spilling out fracking waste. And in the center is this hand, and this hand is shooting out this protest banner that says climate justice now. And the reason why it's a choose your own adventure is because there's two ways that you can look at this image. In one way, we can look at it in kind of a negative point of view where you see all these different issues, and they're all really overwhelming, you know, like children are getting sick by all of these rigs that are right next to elementary schools, and like, why is there fracking waste being, you know, spilled into our waterways when we rely on those for life every day? Or, you know, why are these tunnel projects being put forward? Mind you, there are efforts against all of those things, so don't lose hope. But this person can be seen in one Choose Your Own Adventure narrative of this person screaming out climate justice now as all these issues are like weighing heavy on them. And I think that's something that I think all of us that were drawn to this event like really see in ourselves, is like sometimes all of this stuff is really overwhelming. And I think one thing is that it's okay to be overwhelmed, I think it's important to acknowledge and hold those emotions because that just shows how much you care. And this person's being like weighed down by it, and maybe they're just shouting this as they're getting like drowned in all the weight of it. But you can see this also in another sense. So what if this hand was saying climate justice now, and there are many hands underneath that water that cared about all of these issues so much that this is just breaking the barrier of bringing up this conversation that's needed, right? And that this hand is one of many underneath this water that are pushing it up as like the thing that we need to prioritize and care for in this fight. And I don't know, which story would you want to be a part of? Many hands, right? Many hands make for light work. So one of the projects I'm working on right now, this is the one of the Beehive Design Collective graphics, and we do visual storytelling education using really intricate murals. I can't quite speak to any specific stories because this is a bit of a blurry image, but we use these graphics and we tell stories through different plants and animals and use metaphors to explain human stories of environmental and social injustices. And that work is really powerful because it allows space for intersectionality. Like if you can kind of see, there's this massive tree. Do people see that on the top left? It's like a perspective, almost as if you're like an ant looking up at this trunk of a giant tree. And nestled within the roots of that tree are scenes of different grassroots resilience and resistance efforts. So many issues are represented in this graphic, and I do a lot, most of my public speaking work is all about talking about these issues. So there's, images about like water for life versus water for profit, natural food systems versus industrialized agriculture, solidarity economy, issues where we can try and reimagine our society, prioritizing the needs of our youth and future generations and have that be the economic motivator instead of accumulating profit, and other scenes. But what this graphic and what the nature of that work that I am doing is really centered on trying to make sure that as we're moving towards efforts for justice, is that we really tap on all the different things that are deeply unequal about our society, and that if we are going into a period of time where this climate crisis is apparent, we should channel it to create transcendent justice that really taps into all these different issues, because you can't solve this piecemeal or a piece at a time. We need to think about how we're all being affected. And climate change is such a complex issue that encompasses so many things. It encompasses economics, it encompasses social dynamics. It encompasses, like at the climate negotiations, we did an action at COP21 alongside the Paris Agreement, thinking about how we would stand in solidarity with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which was a coalition of different countries that were most impacted, stand to be the most impacted by climate change. And what I'm really trying to say is that we need to be able to figure out how to think about these things in a way that is intersectional, because a lot of the island nations around the world and the most vulnerable countries to climate change are feeling this first. When we think about the talk before mine, about sea level rise, like San Diego looks really, really wet. But, 3 minutes? Oh, dang. Okay. Well, yeah. But at the same time, there are countries that are standing to experience the worst impacts, more severe ones. I didn't realize 30 minutes would go so fast, so I'm just going to keep running through. Okay. So, I'm going to just end with this one, just because I feel like let's end with something that I really am stoked about, which is the idea of public social accountability. And a lot of my work is really centered on how do we create narratives and bring them into spaces so that we can create narratives that capacity can be lent to, and that when we shape something, when we shape a new story, that creates the opportunity to make it real. So this is an action that we did both at the day that Trump was elected at the climate negotiations in Morocco, but we went to the Native Nations Rising March in April in Washington, D.C., and we made this people's to-do list that really speak to different dynamics that we wanted to name. So Are people willing to kind of do to close off, just kind of a quick like chant thing to end us? Cool. So we did this action in front of the White House and in front of the Trump International Hotel. And it kind of goes something like this, and you just follow my lead. This is the people's to-do list. This is the people's to-do list. Work for climate justice. Respect indigenous sovereignty. Honor the treaties. Cut corporate ties. Zero by 2050. Break free from fossil fuels. Commit to a just transition. No corporate trade deals. Stop militarism. And inhumane policies. Protect water. Protect water. Anyway, thank you. And with that, I'd love to bring up the next speaker. Sweet.
So my days of being on the bullhorn are past me, so I'll spare you guys. But could we give another round of applause to Ryan? It's actually like really hard and stressful to be the hype person at any protest, so I applaud you. Yeah, thanks. I'm a little shorter. Awesome. So can you guys hear me okay? Great. So my name is Nwakama Agbo, and I'm really honored to be able to share with you all some of the work that I've been doing over the past some years now. I'm based out of Oakland, California. I'm currently a fellow at the Movement Strategy Center. I'm also a fellow with the Rudolph Starnold Foundation Integrated Capital Fellowship, and so I'll be spending some time talking about how I came to this work and how I actually look at the intersecting crisis of not only the environmental crisis, but the economic inequality crisis, and how those things interact as negative feedback loops that end up disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color. And so Brenda mentioned this in the introduction early on. Some of my earlier work was with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And this was when Van Jones was leading our organization, and we were calling for green-collar jobs. Jobs that created a pathway out of poverty while fighting pollution at the same time. And at this moment in my early organizing campaign, and looking back on it now, I realized that one of the things we had missed is that we actually weren't bold and audacious enough in our demands. We were calling for jobs when we needed to actually be thinking about positioning ourselves to have an ownership stake and decision-making power over the businesses that end up making our local economy. And so I'll spend some time actually talking through why I think ownership is important, and not just ownership by itself, but ownership in partnership with community governance, and how we actually bring those things together to then advance our own political vision for what we want our communities to look like. But to start off, I think it's helpful to actually understand the way certain practices are embedded within our economic system and end up reinforcing themselves and making it so that low-income communities of color end up in the situation like what we've seen in Hurricane Harvey. So if we were to look at the housing situation, we could look at California, but particularly in the Bay Area. One of the things that always comes up is extraction. There's ways in which we actually set up our economy to not only extract resources, but extract labor and extract ideas from low-income communities of color. And then exclusion. We end up creating policies or bureaucracy, kind of like that $40,000 or 40,000-page document that Ryan had up earlier, that make it hard for people to meaningfully engage in the process. So we exclude them from being able to participate. And this actually leads to accumulation, right? When you deny people the opportunity to participate, then they're able to actually accumulate more resources, more wealth for themselves. And then this supports their ability to actually have control over the decisions, policies, and initiatives that are made and how they shape our lives. And so really, oh no, okay, well, the first image, oh, that's so sad. So the first image kind of touches on the way housing stock is extracted from our economy. I think we've seen this with the subprime mortgage crisis most recently, and we've seen it through policies like redlining. I was recently listening to a report that talked about we actually are in a process of modern day redlining, where 61 cities across the United States have actually shown that they are continuing to impact or deny low-income communities of color, particularly Black and brown communities, the opportunity to purchase homes. And as we know, home ownership is the way that you generate wealth, and it's the way you actually create economic stability and growth for your family and for your community. And so practices like redlining that deny certain people from being able to purchase homes in particular communities then leads to exclusion or displacement. In Oakland right now, if you were to drive through the city, almost under any tunnel you were to drive through, you would see hordes of tent housings. Numbers of people are actually not able to afford living in Oakland. I would say it's actually, it was cheaper for my husband and I to figure out how to pull together our remaining student loans to purchase a home in Oakland than it was for us to think about renting in Oakland. And so then this ends up leading to accumulation, where we've seen property managers in Oakland. There's a gentleman, Rick Marr. Next to the city and the county, he is the third largest property owner. So he was actually able to capitalize on what we saw happen with the economic recession, purchase a number of homes, and use that as a way of accumulating wealth. And then this leads to control. So when we have companies like Airbnb, and this is not a judgment on people who use Airbnb, I've used it myself, but companies that actually position themselves and say that they're actually creating a shared economy have created ways for people that actually already own housing stock to then rent out those homes, taking those housing units off of the rental market, which are needed, and then you get huge corporations, right? And so just last year, Airbnb was able to spend $8 million to defeat a proposition on the ballot in San Francisco to asking landlords to register their housing units, right? So this is how we see corporations are able to then shape and impact government and our ability to actually create an economy that supports the needs of the people that live right there. And I lift this up because I think it's important to note that we didn't actually get to where we're at with the levels of economic inequality by mistake. In 1971, there's a gentleman called Lewis Powell who wrote what's called the Powell Memo. And it was essentially a document that was put together to explain to CEOs and business owners how to start positioning their corporations to be able to shape and impact a democracy. This gentleman then went on to become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Right? And so now we can actually look at laws like Citizens United. We could look at rampant voter suppression tactics throughout the South to actually understand a lot of the economic inequality that we see now that's exacerbated by environmental degradation has been by design. And I lift this up because it's important to note that just as Lewis Powell was as intentional, deliberate, and rigorous in eroding not only our democracy, but also our economy, we also have to be just as intentional, deliberate, and rigorous in implementing solutions that actually get us to the equality that we do want to see. And so, when looking at economy, when I took my first econ class and I thought about what does economy mean, I think some of the old paradigm, right, is that we think about concepts of elasticity, supply and demand, the ways that we look at measuring GDP. But the root of the word economy is actually the management of home. And so when I think of a term like home, I think about my family, the culture, the tradition, the art, the vibrant ways that we want to live. And so as we think about what are the solutions to actually get us out of the crises that we see now, we also have to rethink our relationship to economy. And not just see our relationship to economy as one of that's just numbers and dollars and cents, but it's actually all the ways that we are structuring society, right? It's the cultural strategy. It's the way we interact with one another. And I think this is important because as Ryan is lifting up, just as the problems that we're experiencing are interconnected when looking at social inequities, environmental crisis, economic inequalities, we also actually need to develop strategies that are interconnected as well. And so we need to actually figure out what are our practices that move us away from extraction to regeneration, from control to governing for the whole, from accumulation to shared prosperity, and then from exclusion to inclusion. And so the work that I do is about lifting up a model for restorative economics that is really about how do we get to a just transition? How do we move away from an extractive, pollutive economy and towards one that is actually regenerative and focused on renewables? And I think it's important to lift up that in order to actually create a just economy, we need to recognize that there are communities that have been denied access and the opportunity to benefit from a lot of the great stuff that our economy has to offer. And so restorative economic looks at how do we prioritize the socioeconomic and political resources for the most impacted communities to ensure that they actually get to be a part of the great just transition that we're working for right now. Because once again, anything less, and let me know if I'm talking too fast, I'm trying to get through all of it, anything less than being intentional and rigorous about supporting those most impacted communities means that they will be continued to be left behind. And so the work that I do is really about figuring out how do we create models of community ownership? How do we move away from a model that's focused on individual riches and towards shared prosperity? And doing that through worker-owned cooperatives, doing that through collective ownership, doing it through the commons, all the different ways we can collectively own and manage different types of resources and assets. And then how do we lift up models of community governance, right? How do we reinvigorate the civic engagement that we want to see in our communities so that people don't only feel like they're forced to only engage once every 4 years in election, but it can actually start to imagine themselves as active stewards of their community, right? And we actually get to figure out how do we get beyond laws like Citizens United, beyond voter suppression tactics, and figure out how are we creating a mechanism for people to engage that steward our energy, our water, our land, all the resources that we need to thrive for the benefit of everybody. And really understanding that at the end of the day, what we're trying to get at is not just more people owning things together, but how do we actually leverage that collective ownership of those economic assets to advance our political, economic, and the cultural strategies that we want to see in our communities? And so to really get at restorative economics, one of the first things I like to lift up is the importance of acknowledgement and repair. And this is really couched in a restorative justice approach. One of the best ways I heard this put was by Brian Stevens of the Equal Justice Society, and he kind of lifted up, when you get in an argument with your partner, and you recognize that you were at fault, you caused the hurt, if you really care about this person, many of us will oftentimes go to whatever lengths it takes to repair that harm, right? To rebuild that relationship. And so part of what we're tasked with is how do we actually acknowledge the harm that's been disproportionately levied upon low-income communities of color so that we can actually heal and begin to move forward together. And so when I look at restorative economics, particularly when you're looking at the experience of Black people in this country, 40 acres and a mule is a tagline that we often hear, but it was something that was actually promised to people post-emancipation, quote-unquote emancipation, right? But what ended up happening is that leaders recognized if we actually gave people access to land and the ability to till that land, then they would have the opportunity to create meaningful and dignified lives, right? They would know how to work that land because they've been working it for centuries. They would be able to then have spaces where they could congregate safely, create schools, create hospitals, create all the things that make it possible for us to live with dignity. And so that's why it was actually pulled back. And so the Black Land and Liberation Initiative is an initiative that launched last year by two organizations, the Movement Generation and Blackout Collective, to actually engage people in a conversation about what does it look like to engage in a conversation of reparations for Black people, descendants of slaves in this country. And so starting to think about our relationship to the resources and how we use that as an opportunity to repair a lot of the harm that's been done. One of the projects I've been excited to work on has been Restore Oakland. So Restore Oakland is an initiative that centers around an impacted population, particularly formerly incarcerated individuals and low-wage workers in the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry is the second largest industry in the United States, but it's the most segregated by sector, so fast food to fine dining, and then segregated by occupation, front of the house and back of the house. And it's also the number one employer of formerly incarcerated individuals. And so the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and Restaurant Opportunity Centers United came together to create a restorative justice community advocacy training center in East Oakland. So we'll be able to have restorative justice programs that bring people together to meaningfully address conflict for reconciliation and restitution, and then also being able to have a training restaurant where we actually get to provide jobs for people in the restaurant industry and make sure that they have access to those good quality jobs in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, a fine dining restaurant job can run you 6 figures. So when you're thinking about a community that's under pressure of displacement, being able to have a pathway and access into those jobs is extremely important. The other key piece around restorative economics is thinking through collaborative governance, right? So building a process that brings together the public, private, and civic sector to build trust over a period of time where all different individuals are being able to define the problem, figure out what the solutions are, and then work towards implementation together. One of the things I like to lift up for people is that it takes a really long time to build trust. It takes an instant to break it. And so when we're thinking about a lot of the crises that are before us, every time we come up against a stumbling block where someone may put out a 40,000 page document that impedes our ability to engage in the process, that breaks trust. So collaborative governance is figuring out how do we bring people together? How do we level the power differential that happens between the private and the public sector with the community to really co-design solutions together? One of the things I think is important is also figuring out how do we shift away from only thinking, voting, or thinking of governance in terms of me and mine to really understanding what do we need as a collective body. So there are some key issues that I would argue, be it education, housing, healthcare, that we should start to look at as basic human rights. Right? And when we start to understand, when we make decisions that center the most impacted people, the rest of us are better. So in Oakland, when we have young people living on the streets because they have been kicked out of their home, if we look at an issue around access to safe and healthy food, when a young person is able to eat 3 meals a day in Oakland, chances are the rest of us will get to eat 3 meals a day in Oakland. And not just that child, but their family, their neighbors, and really understanding that when we center the most impacted people, we actually can make decisions that are better off for all of us. So the Richmond Community-Owned Development Entity is another project that I'm working on that really centers around the needs of renters that are at stake of being displaced in Richmond. This is an initiative that grew out of an effort that UC Berkeley was going to build a global campus in the city of Richmond. The community organized to demand certain community benefits. It was actually a really great working group that brought together the city and the students and the UC system, but what ended up happening is that project fell through. However, the community said, we actually are still clear. We think development is important in our community, and we want to figure out how do we do development that actually reinvest those resources back in the community. How do we do development in a way that it positions that community to not only have an ownership stake, but decision-making opportunity and what those developments are, how they're developed, and what it means for the community. So this is an initiative to kind of understand how does the financing impact our ability to do community-driven planning and development, and what are the different governance structures across different legal entities that hold different buildings that make it possible for people to generate and participate in some of the wealth being created in their community through development. And the last piece is really understanding the different models for community wealth. In 2008, I had the opportunity to go to the Mondragon Collective in the northern Basque region of Spain. Mondragon is a cooperative corporation that from their banking system to their education system to the manufacturing system, everything is run as a cooperative. So they've actually figured out how to have different structures that allow workers, leadership, community members to engage in the governing process and decision-making processes of how those businesses are run. And so whether we're looking at the growth in worker-owned cooperatives, which is extremely exciting, or we're also looking at initiatives like direct public offerings. Direct public offerings are a way that it allows non-accredited investors or those individuals that don't have a certain amount of wealth. There's a securities law that only requires if you make a certain amount of income, you are only deemed worthy of investing in your community. However, we've had initiatives in Oakland where people want to create a grocery store. What does it look like to create mechanisms for low-income individuals to also invest in that grocery store, and that be their methodology for community wealth? Because one of the facts of the matter is in order to address the level of climate change we're in right now, not everybody in the world will be able to live as we do in the United States. So we need to be creative in thinking about the different ways we're structuring wealth and how we're defining wealth. And then also looking at the commons. The commons is something that was big when this country was first founded. Some of you have probably walked around Boston Commons. It's a thing. But what we're also coming up against is the way that corporate interests are eroding our ability to really honor the commons. In Oakland, we've had challenges with local government actually selling off city property to private developers without engaging in a public process. That's the erosion of the commons. And so what we get to think about right now is how do we reclaim those assets and steward them for the collective. And so the One Vivere Fund is another project that I've been working on. I sit on the board of 1,000 Currents, and it's an organization that provides grant making in the global south. So the One Vivere Fund has brought together investors in the global north, so looking at the Novo Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, to figure out how do you actually engage in a deep partnership with communities in the global south to create the terms of investment. Right? So oftentimes when we think about an investment fund, we want to get what's called market rate returns, right? Which may be 10%, 12%. Those market rate returns actually end up extracting more wealth out of the individuals than they're initially investing, particularly if we're looking at the exchange rate of the dollar, the US dollar, to what it means in Guatemala. Right? So being able to actually rethink the terms of investment, being able to think about how do we use our depth of relationship with somebody to be the collateral that underrides our ability to invest in a startup business as opposed to having them put up their home or their car. We have an opportunity to rethink how we use capital and resources so that actually helps to regenerate community. And part of what needs to happen there is creating the spaces for us to build relationships with one another and really challenge our assumptions around money and capital and how we hold each other accountable when using those different resources. And so one of the things I think is important to underscore is that we're in an exciting moment where people are really figuring out how do we move away from extraction and accumulation towards redistribution of wealth and regeneration of our economy. One of the challenges that I found is actually not the conversation around redistribution of wealth. Redistribution of wealth ultimately means redistribution of power. Right? Redistribution of our ability to have control and say over our lives and our livelihood. And so in order for an individual to actually feel that they can meaningfully engage in a conversation about redistributing their power, they may actually need to figure out, do we actually have the level of trust where we could ensure that I would make a decision that would benefit Ryan, right? If Ryan and I did not have that level of trust, what incentive is there for him to think about redistributing his wealth and therefore redistributing his power? But if we're engaged in a deep relationship and we are clear that we share values, then we can actually think about what it looks like for us to make sure that low-income communities of color also have the opportunities to meaningfully shape their lives and their livelihood. And all of this happens within the context of the social movements that make it possible for us to have these conversations. So there's times in which a lot of what's happening across our country and around the world in terms of what's people call social unrest, I think of it as rebellion, is seen as contentious. But those conversations, those protests actually make it possible for us to open up conversations and rethink the way we've structured our economy in different ways, to understand also how our economy then does end up impacting our environment and the way we treat one another. And so one of the things I think is helpful to kind of just drive this point home is I think it's worth noting that Flint, Michigan still does not have clean drinking water. We still have kids in Flint, Michigan that are using bottled water and bathing with bottled water. What restorative economics gets us to do is to really understand what would it look like if Flint, Michigan had the power to make decisions about its water rights, right? What if the community actually owned the water rights in the system, much like we saw the indigenous community fighting for with the North Dakota Access Pipeline? There was an effort in San Antonio where a community, the Pajarito community, actually was an unincorporated community. And one of the reasons they didn't want to incorporate and they didn't want to actually build out their water infrastructure was fear of gentrification and displacement. So for a long time, the community actually decided not to engage in setting up a water system. But it got to a point where they realized, we actually need running water to support our homes. But the community figured out, could we actually set up a water association where the residents are actually members of the water association, they make decisions together, they pay regular water rights, and then they all share the use of that water together? What could models like that mean for a community like Flint, Michigan? I think that's what we're actually up against when we're trying to understand the way a lot of these crises reinforce and impact one another. I think the other thing I would love to underscore that I think was helpful from the conversations about sea level rise is that even in looking at Hurricane Harvey, of the 8 counties that were hit hardest by Hurricane Harvey, only 17% of homeowners in those counties were able to afford flood insurance. Right, so our ability to actually have the resources to protect ourselves, protect our communities in the face of climate change is extremely important. I just found out a couple weeks ago, I actually live in the floodplain. Sorry, I'm not the scientist. I live in a floodplain in East Oakland. It's called the Flats, right next to where the Warriors play. And so my husband and I, we just bought our house in 2016, are trying to have strategic conversations about what does it mean to then move to another part of the country where we can also have a home. And this is a home that under all odds we actually weren't supposed to be able to buy, based on the fact that we both came from working poor immigrant households. So that's how a lot of these crises continue to converge, and just wanted to kind of underscore that we still have opportunities if we think about creating mechanisms for ownership and governance. And so as we're moving through different solutions, really lifting up the importance of being able to center the most impacted people in the design and the process and the outcomes of the solutions that we put forth. And since it's All-Stars weekend, I just want to say go Warriors. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you. I think these talks actually tied together really well. And if I could have the 3 speakers come up and we'll field some questions. We have about 20 minutes to have a conversation with you all. And I think there's some mics going around. Crystal's got a mic and Sherry's got a mic. In my class, I pick on students. I don't know your names, so.
Hi, I'm Naomi, and I want to thank all 3 of you for really fabulous presentations. I was just amazed, Getta, that you were so articulate and poised, and it was through Skype. That was a tremendous presentation. So thank you. Actually, Getta, I want to ask you, I really liked the comment you made several times that we now have science-based proof and indications for these events like the floodings and other events that some people call natural disasters, and we know otherwise. And I was really interested in a little bit more about that. If you can tell us what is the science that we know about Harvey and others that we can, because I think that is what's going to be really important in the future as we talk to people who are still skeptics.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a great question, and I'm really glad to be here physically now. So the information that I showed about Hurricane Harvey and a lot of the really great work that's been done to do really rapid analysis of what the role of human-caused climate change is in a lot of these natural disasters that we've been seeing is a group called the World Weather Attribution, which is made up of a group of scientists from around the world that have all come together to recognize the fact that these disasters are hugely tragic, and one way to make sure that those impacts don't happen in vain is to make sure that the causes get communicated at that time when people are paying attention to them. And so there are many aspects of climate change where we can start to make those attributions now. One of the places is in extreme rainfall, and that's because it's very easy for us to say that as temperature rises, the atmosphere can hold more water, and when the atmosphere can hold more water, it can dump more water in places very quickly. Another place where it's very easy for us to do that based on the science that we know is in heat waves. Temperature increase is one of the clearest aspects of human-induced climate change right now, and that same group, World Weather Attribution, has done some really important work demonstrating the role of human-caused climate change in places like during the European heat wave and other places where you can actually start attributing individual deaths that would not have happened in the absence of human-caused climate change. And I think when you can start having those kinds of quantitative discussions, I think a lot of the discussion around restorative economics and a lot of the work that Ryan does really demonstrates the way that we need to move away from some of these quantitative metrics if we want to try to really address the root of some of these things that we haven't figured out how to value yet in a quantitative way. But I think where we can, being able to do that kind of attribution allows us to enter that quantitative discussion and say, okay, in a world where we value damages at this amount, here is the amount of that damage that is caused by climate change. Now, what is the benefit that we're getting by investing in preventing that?
So, Ryan, do you have any ideas there was a lot of energy, obviously, around the country and around the world with the women's marches and the different movements. And it seems like with all that passion, then they are just over, and there's not as much that is done with that energy moving forward. It just kind of like, to me, seems like we did a great march and you got all this energy and this positivity, and then there's no place for it to go, and everybody goes back to work and you just kind of go along. Do you have any ideas?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I definitely resonate with the fact that movement moments are these ways that are like mics for the issues that happen, and then afterwards, where does that energy go? And in terms of that, that's been, I think, a constant challenge for a lot of folks that are in the movement is like, where do we channel energy? And I think a lot of it comes down to how do we like get out of the like preparing for a mobilization space and like try and enable and make real the values that are being displayed at these mobilizations in like strong ways. And I think one thing that I could really think about is, actually thinking about, your work as well with like restorative economics is we have the ability and capacity, I think, to make these decisions on a smaller scale or on a local scale. And I think, municipal decisions that are like held in the context of communities are like ways to like show different examples of how we can do things differently. Like one thing that is particularly notable is the Seguratea land trust in Oakland or Ohlone territory is these Ohlone women and these communities are building a land tax in order to channel resources from the public to create community gardens and really build society build new ways of being in society, like through tangible projects. And I think that with the political climate that we see now, I think there's so many things that could be done. I mean, and I think what I would hope to give an answer to is that we need to take these actions and put them or take the desire for actions and put them in a visible way, like to everything that we do. And yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts? Because that's a huge question, and I think a lot of us are desiring, like, how do we make impact? And you know, we all play a part in that. So, do either of you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I would add on to that is the ability to move things on the federal scale is actually just not going to happen politically, right? And so what we need to actually think about, what are the ways that we can engage locally and on the statewide level. So in Oakland and even the state of California, it's exciting to see conversations about a public bank and what a public bank means for being able to generate revenue for the state, or looking at single-payer healthcare. So this is a place where oftentimes it's easy to plug into national movements because they have a bit more coverage, and I try to encourage people to do the due diligence to understand what's happening locally, and to figure out where we can plug in locally and figure out what are those projects that we can start to build together. The other piece is because of the lack of opportunity on the federal scale to advance political change, I think that there's so much that goes in terms of like just building community and deepening relationships with individuals. And one thing that I found really inspiring was after the election to hear that there were so many different ways that people were gathering and holding dinners together and coming together in community. And I would say our ability and commitment to continue to invest in those relationships while we're also trying to understand what's possible on a larger political scale is kind of what I like to offer to people.
I had a follow-up question. The community building is a form of ecological resilience in relation to if we care for and the most impacted, you know, everyone is going to be thriving. Do you see links to that in relation to the larger climate picture that Getta painted? Because I mean that seems tangible, and I'm not really sure in terms of the 2030, 2050 picture, right? I can think about myself, my family, my kids, but how do we move from the point of building this type of local resilience through relationships, and how do we make that bridge to the question of stemming, you know, the temperatures? It's a big question, but like, what are the steps between the three of you here within your realms of expertise?
So I can just say something to the really broad part of that, which is that it seems it was really inspiring to have been at the COP23 meeting, and I was so excited that you were in the picture that I showed. You know, I think it's clear from that there's sort of a groundswell happening from both directions in the sense that there is movement and action happening at an international scale. And I think from a purely scientific standpoint, you need that because you have to fill all the gaps and reduce the emissions across the board if you're going to reduce temperatures in the ways that we need to. But that is not separate or decoupled from the things that are happening at the local scale. And in many ways, that momentum that has happened at the international scale is only possible because of the momentum that started and has only been maintained because of the momentum that's happening at the local scale. So that's just been my perspective from coming at it from the more international perspective.
The other piece I'd offer, so there's an effort happening in the Bay Area to look at sea level rise that's being led by an organization called Resilient by Design. And so they reached out to me to see if I could help advise them on their community engagement strategy. And what I found was so interesting is that when you're bringing together some of the leading agencies that deal with architecture, engineering, planning around a lot of these issues, their solutions continue to leave community out of the conversation. And so what has been interesting is working with urban planners in this work to really understand when we're looking at developing innovative designs to address sea level rise, how do we think about the community benefits, right? Who is actually building out to those different development projects? Are we doing local hire? Are we providing a minimum wage? Like, there's ways for us to think about how we take the unfortunate crisis that we're in and leverage it to address the immediate impacts that a lot of communities are experiencing. And I think one of the devastating opportunities about what's happening around intense climate weather is that more and more people are being impacted. And so if we could think about organizing that base in a productive way to engage in these issues, I feel like that would kind of be the way we parlay this moment. But there's a lot of work to figure out how do you actually meaningfully create pathways for people to plug into it.
Just want to throw in another piece as well is I think three pieces, three potential solutions that feel really real in my head, I think is just trying to harness the societal imagination that we've held for a long time as a human society, and channel it towards making new ways of thinking and being that take into stock all of what was shared from the three of us collectively. And those three pieces are, in my head, and this is my opinion, is the principles of decarbonization in terms of making sure that we lower emissions to the point that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the point that protects small island nations and other vulnerable communities. Decentralization, which addresses the fact that there is an unequal amount of power and wealth distributed from the massive elite to the many. And decolonization, which is really built upon the idea of understanding what systems of oppression are at play that continue to create differentiated harm to different communities. And we see that through all these different examples, like Amaka, when you shared in your presentation, the fact of Black Lives Matter, or when we think about movements of tribes that are fighting to protect their land from treaties that have been signed by the federal government but are not being honored because of corporations at play. Or when we think about the fact that, even drawing a parallel to the fact that in the international space, you have small island nations fighting for literally their lands to exist, their islands to exist. And that is such a metaphor to the systemic racism that we see in large-scale climate discussions or large-scale climate crisis, to how that shows up in the ways that we relate to each other as people. I think that those three forces of decolonization, decarbonization, and decentralization are three kind of thought processes that we can hold to really understand what is happening in our society. Why is there all of these different issues going on, and how are they interlocked in ways that are really unavoidable? So that's a process those are kind of these mental frameworks that I use in the work that I do to try and make sure that message and that narrative gets held, because that can be brought on by, again, more tangible action that you're bringing up, like restorative economics and other things.
Well, is there a question?
Nwakama, I really liked your point earlier about how trust is very central to how trust between communities is really central to restorative economics. But for me personally, it's kind of hard to imagine that kind of trust being built, especially when you see so much polarization on the national level. So I was kind of wondering and this is a question for all three of you, I guess in your work, kind of on the more local levels, have you do you have any examples of instances in which that type of trust is built or maintained or exists, or just anything like that?
Yeah, I think thanks for keeping it 100. So I think the goal is not to make sure that we are aligned on everything, but it's actually to figure out where the alignment does exist. And so in Oakland, and I would say in a number of different campaigns throughout the history of our country, there have been ways in which unlikely allies have come together to actually find solutions that they can work on together. And I would say the green collar jobs movement was an opportunity to bring together the educational sector, the business sector, even unionized and ununionized workers to really figure out out how do we position green jobs? How do we position a renewable energy sector as a win-win for all of us? We've also had other campaigns in Oakland with the redevelopment of the port of Oakland, where we've been able to bring together the developer and the community and the local government to really iron out some clear community benefits, making sure that there's a workforce training center so that workers can actually have access to those jobs that are coming in first. And so I think it takes a really skilled organizer. It takes leaders who are willing to really listen to one another and who aren't stuck in their own desired outcomes, but are willing to actually engage in that process. Like I said, redefining the problem and understanding what the opportunities are to really figure out what is the one thing that we can work on together. I'm really clear there may be other situations where we are on opposite sides of the table with each other, but there may be some places where we actually can do some work together. And let's figure out what those things are rather than always only staying on opposite ends of the table.
I can maybe just speak to a very personal level with that. Being a climate scientist, this comes up all the time in my personal relationships. How do we deal with these issues of polarization and trust around even communicating the fact that climate change is happening to relatives, to friends who may be resistant to that type of information, which is often the first step to getting them to recognize the ways in which climate change interfaces with all of these other issues that we have and the ways that we need to address it. And what I've found is that I think within the climate scientific community for a long time, there has been this mode of just passing the information in one direction. And I have always found that to be universally unsuccessful with my family members who are not automatically receptive to that. And the thing that I've found most beneficial for getting that information flow happening, but also for me personally and understanding where my work fits into the lives of the people that I love, is to have that be a conversation and have to make part of that listening and to understand why they aren't receptive to that information and where are they getting their information from, and where did their mindset come from. And building that trust and that sense of communication has always been the absolute the necessary condition for any kind of problem solving or actual information flow happening. So I think that point about trust is absolutely key, both when you're talking about organizing and getting to actual solutions, but also when you're just trying to explain what the problem is.
Sorry, can I add more there to like the rest of it? So I think the other reason that's really important, I think, so Kathy's triangle, the way we tell stories, so we're actually not having a conversation about politics, right? We're telling the story of what's happening in communities. And I also think this is why cultural strategy has to be key to any of the conversations that were happening, because culture precedes politics, right? And so if we're able to shift the culture under which we're having these conversations, that gets us to a point then where we can actually talk about politics. And storytelling throughout all of that has been one of the things that I've seen most effective in moving people forward.
Just want to quickly say that one tangible example that I've experienced is during the fight against the twin tunnels in the Delta. There have been, like you said, many unlikely allies, like fishermen and tribes that would ordinarily be at odds, gathered together in a united pursuit against corporations that were exploiting the waterways that both depended on. And one thing that was I think a really good storytelling example of being able to directly link different issues was there was one point in the battle against the tunnels where they were putting up this precedent of eminent domain to take over lands of local farmers just to be able to build these tunnels. And these landowners all of a sudden were just like, whoa, like I'm getting super displaced, what's going on? And one of the strategies of Restore the Delta was to bring up this as kind of like a neo-colonialism of like taking over land in a totally unconsensual way. And I think that broke open a dialogue about not only the modern colonialism that was seen by this land being illegally taken for pursuit of this like infrastructure project, but got people to think about colonialism itself and thinking like, oh my gosh, like this is happening to me, and then relating that to like how indigenous peoples have had their lands taken over many times before, or other different issues of environmental racism like become really clear, and you're able to link it through that story. And I think that's one experience I've had.
Kathy?
Yeah, this is jumping back a little bit to the beginning of the questions where, Gita, you were talking about the progress that's been made in our ability to attribute an extreme weather event, what percentage or contribution is from the human-caused climate change. I just wanted to comment, because I think it's a promising area of potential progress, is that there's also work being done along those lines, trying to tie the increased carbon in the atmosphere back to specific companies, a certain number of specific companies. I think the important piece of that, rather than just saying like, okay, a coal company from 1910 is responsible for X percentage of the extra carbon that we've added to our atmosphere, is that have that narrative specifically around, since there's been a scientific consensus on the dangers of climate change, which is actually from longer ago than we'd like to think, a strong amount of certainty, looking at the emissions that have come since that time, and then contrasting that with the actions of those same companies to confuse whether or not there is a scientific consensus and to block clean energy progress. And that is helping to sort of underpin a lot of some new litigation efforts where people are really trying to sue the fossil fuel industry for those emissions vis-a-vis their lying about it when we started to know. So that's an encouraging area of progress, I think, too.
Thank you. Well, I think it's 5. We're rounding into 5. So thank you all for coming. And the speakers are going to be here for a little bit. So feel free to come. And I think many of you will also be going to the dinner or reception afterwards, the Pitzer Society. So thank you again for coming.